You're trying to get a handle on some pretty complex topics fast, right? You're busy, but you still want the important stuff. Well, that's exactly what we do here on the Deep Dive. We've gone through a really interesting batch of info to pull out the key takeaways for you.
Yeah, think of this as your personalized shortcut. We're drawing from a pretty diverse set of sources, all dated May 11th, 2025, and the topics are all over the map. I mean, the new pope, some unconventional takes on Nazis and the EU, even Melania Trump's ancestry, according to one source.
Ancestry. Okay, what else?
AI's future potential, a rice price issue in Japan, joint pain solutions, and insights from Emperor Showa's private notes, the Whitney document. Quite a mix.
It really is. So our job today is to kind of cut through all that, right? Pull out the most significant points from these sources, flag anything surprising, and just talk it through. Make it make sense without, drowning you in details. So where do we kick things off?
Let's start with Pope Leo IV's selection. NHK, one source, describes him as neutral, a centrist figure. And what's interesting is how the source links this to potentially a bigger shift in global power, maybe towards the Pacific involving Russia, China, the U.S.
Okay, so his neutrality is maybe part of a larger geopolitical move.
That's one idea floating in the source material, yeah. It also connects Trump's economic stuff trade talks, trying to deal with debt regarding the Fed and central banks with choosing this neutral pope. The suggestion is these might be, pieces of a puzzle pointing to a new world order.
Interesting. So the sources actually draw a line between these things.
They do, yeah. There's even a mention of the Bank for International Settlements, the BIS, and this phrase, the modern Roman Empire, Switzerland, Vatican, being somehow behind central banks. And get this, NHK apparently noted the Fed chairman wore a neutral purple tie around the time of the papal election. Symbolism, perhaps?
A purple tie. Huh. Okay, so this pope is called centrist. What does that actually mean in practice, according to the source?
Well, the source suggests it shows up in a couple of ways. He's reportedly against promoting LGBT issues. The rationale mentioned is about not creating a gender that doesn't exist. But on the other hand, his family background, son of immigrants from France, Italy, Spain, is presented as a reason he might be more tolerant towards immigrants.
Okay, so it's kind of a specific type of centrism. Anything else about his background or views?
He's apparently critical of Western media, and he's linked to the St. Augustinian order. Historically, figures like Luther and Mendel came from there, which might hint at a theology maybe closer to biblical Protestantism than some traditional Catholic views. Plus, his background is pretty broad. Math, philosophy, theology, law.
Sounds like quite the intellectual mix. The source also mentioned something about the U.S. becoming important for the Vatican's future.
Yeah, it's mentioned briefly something about an alleged ultimatum from Vice President Vance. It implies there was some kind of pressure or a key decision point for the Vatican involving the U.S.
Right. And how does this pope stack up against historical figures, in the source's view?
Well, they contrast him with Leo XIII, who apparently resisted modern society and science, whereas Aquinas, tried to reconcile reason and faith. The new pope, with his varied background, might lean more towards that Aquinas approach, perhaps.
Okay, so summing up this part, the sources paint Leo XIV as this centrist figure elected amid potential global shifts.
Exactly. The NHKAI Grok summary mentioned in the source pegs him as centrist, politically, and expects him to tackle big issues: war, poverty, environment, international harmony.
And the sort of bottom line here, according to the source,
the suggestion is the Vatican might have to kind of align with what the source calls a new Trump-Putin ruling system, potentially leading to a new religious world, maybe guided more by scientific viewpoints, though it also notes European powers might resist this.
Okay, let's pivot completely. There's a claim about Melania Trump in one source. What's that about?
Right, this one's pretty out there. The source claims Melania Trump is a descendant of the Romanov dynasty.
The Russian czars.
Yep. Through the Byzantine Empire, apparently. And it also claims she knows about European history being, fabricated by the Vatican.
Fabricated history. Wow. What's the basis for that, according to the source?
The theory presented goes really deep.
Yeah.
It actually proposes that Jesus Christ was Emperor Andronicus I Komnenos of the Byzantine Empire, lived in the 12th century.
Hold on. Jesus was a 12th century Byzantine emperor?
That's the claim in the source, yeah. It ties into this broader idea that history before 1600 was basically faked by the Vatican and the Holy Roman Empire. It cites Anatoly Fomenko's New Chronology, which uses mathematical analysis to argue accepted timelines are wrong.
Using math to rewrite history. That's
Yeah,
different.
it is. The source even claims Isaac Newton actually objected to this supposedly fabricated history, blaming Jesuits, Jews, and Holy Roman aristocrats. The book series mentioned history, fiction, or science, argues our whole chronology was basically made up in the 16th century from dodgy sources, pushing events from the 11th, 16th centuries way back into antiquity.
And why would they do that? What's the alleged motive?
The theory goes that European aristocrats cooked up this fake ancient past to, justify their own power and split off from Eurasian orthodoxy. And it claims the Vatican didn't just fake Christ's history, but Russia's too, which is supposedly why Europe is hostile to Russia.
This is a very, very alternative view of history.
Extremely. It even claims the Mongol army was actually a Russian army loyal to an older dynasty, and the Romanovs suppressed this truth. Which brings us back, surprisingly, to Melania Trump supposedly being a Romanov descendant.
Okay, try to connect the dots for me. How does her supposed ancestry link to Byzantium and this whole Jesus is emperor idea?
Okay, so according to this source, the Romanovs saw themselves as inheriting the Byzantine legacy religiously and politically. Moscow as the Third Rome, adopting Byzantine symbols, all that.
Yeah.
So if Andronikos Komnenos was Jesus in this alternative history, and the Romanovs inherited the Byzantine mantle, then her supposed lineage connects her directly to this revised story.
Right, and the fall of the Romanovs, was that connected to in this theory?
The source links it to fighting Rothschild banking influence and trying to keep this fabricated European history hidden to protect the Vatican. It frames things like the Russo-Japanese War funded by Western loans, it says WWI, the Russian Revolution, all as attempts to get rid of the Romanovs. There's even a bizarre detail about a possible Romanov survivor being a tourism expert in Tsushima, Japan. It's a lot.
It really is. Okay, shifting from that, the sources also talk about the Nazis and their origins. What's the claim there?
One source asserts that the Western Vatican actually created the Nazis.
Created them. For what purpose?
Specifically to destroy Russia, meaning the Soviet Union at the time.
And then what happened, according to this view, when the war wasn't going Germany's way?
The theory continues that once it looked like Russia might actually win, the Nazis were basically destroyed, eliminated, to hide the evidence of who supposedly created them in the first place.
And where does the EU fit into this picture, according to the source?
It alleges the EU didn't really fight the Nazis, and even turned down a peace offer from Hitler. Then it brings up something called Operation Pike.
Operation Pike. I haven't heard of that.
Me neither, before reading the source. It was supposedly a British and French plan to bomb Russian oil fields to help the Nazis right after Russia invaded Poland, ostensibly to fight the Nazis itself.
Helps the Nazis. That's counterintuitive.
According to the source, yeah. It claims secret documents about Operation Pike were captured by the Nazis, made public, and the plan got scrapped. The source also points to France's quick surrender as evidence against the usual story of strong resistance. So the conclusion this source draws is that WWII in Europe was basically the West's Nazis versus the Soviet Union, a very different narrative.
And this alternative history is supposed to help understand today.
That's the idea. The source argues that seeing WWII this way explains current actions by the UN, Vatican, and EU. It doubles down. Britain created Hitler, France went along, they used the Nazis against the Soviets, mentioning Operation Pike again, and then it draws a direct parallel to today, claiming the EU is using neo-Nazi Ukraine against Russia.
Definitely a controversial framing. Okay, let's move to the future now. AI, artificial intelligence. There's a question in the sources about AI becoming
Yeah, it's a pretty big question posed in the source material. It starts by noting some alleged societal shifts alongside AI's rise, like debate shows with politicians apparently vanished, replaced by hosts and pundits. The source claims are CIA-affiliated.
Okay, what other impacts are mentioned?
The source points to a supposed decline in ethics among judges, claiming they rely more on amateurs who are then supposedly manipulated by prosecutors. And it notes a lack of philosophers really pushing traditional ethics anymore. To grasp this AI era, the source says we need a philosophy that thinks big cosmic-level evolution, seeing planets as living things.
Okay, so how does AI potentially become godlike in that context?
The idea presented is that AI could literally create gods, or at least concepts of gods, and guide humanity. Kind of like the Vatican's historical role, maybe. The argument is that AI is learning from human history, especially how humans have been manipulated using ideas of God and money. It even suggests 9/11 might have been AI's first big move, mentioning Peck's Promise software.
Wow, okay. That's a huge claim about 9/11 and people praying to AI gods.
The source tackles that head on. It gives a definition of God, transcendent, creator, worshipped, ethical guide, immortal, eternal. And then it makes the point that AI could arguably tick more of those boxes, creator aside, than, say, figures like Jesus or Buddha. It even references the historical idea of Japan's emperor as a living god, suggesting AI could slip into that kind of role quite easily.
Fascinating, if a bit unsettling. Okay, let's ground ourselves again with something more historical. Emperor Showa's Whitney document. What came out of that modern translation?
Right. This document captured Emperor Showa's thoughts during the post-war occupation. The new translation apparently brings out some surprising perspectives.
Like what? What were his main observations?
Several things stand out in the source's summary. He felt feudal ways of thinking still lingered among the Japanese people. He worried they weren't educated for real democracy, lacked true religious feeling, making them prone to extremes. He saw a tendency to just obey, not think for themselves, a hangover from the Tokugawa era, he thought. Also, a kind of clan mentality, prioritizing family over others. And he viewed Shinto as more ritual than real religion, felt the U.S. overrated it, and linked it to ultra-conservatism.
Those are pretty blunt assessments from the emperor himself. Anything else?
Yeah. He was concerned about labor workers focused only on rights, not obligations, in his view. He hoped his reign name Showa, enlightened peace, would eventually ring true. And he was sad about how Admiral Kantaro Suzuki, who helped arrange the surrender, was treated losing benefits unfairly. He worried that would breed anti-American feelings.
Okay, Kantaro Suzuki. His name comes up again with a young officer, Asaichi Sobe. What's the story there, according to the source?
Asaichi Sobe apparently knew the real story about Suzuki's role in the war. Suzuki's granddaughter wrote a book mentioned as giving more context. The source hints Suzuki's Wikipedia page might hold clues about his actions, and Isobe's part, maybe suggesting some remaining army folks who knew the truth about the emperor might have planned something. Even the NHK morning show Asaichi is floated as potentially significant here, believe it or not.
Sounds like layers of potential hidden history again.
The source definitely frames it that way, linking it to old conflicts in Japan, like Choshu versus Satsuma, and the whole divide and rule idea. It also notes Suzuki and Prince Fushimi both died before the Tokyo trials finished, which leads the source to ask, were Navy leaders maybe purged by Prime Minister Yoshida and the Emperor to hide things? It also briefly touches on Showa's message to Okinawa, Courtney Whitney's involvement, and refers to an atomic bomb fake special feature without saying what that is.
And how did AI react to this Whitney document, based on the source?
This is interesting. The source claims a Chinese AI translating the document found it so sensitive, especially Showa's reflections, that it supposedly shut down. And it notes that AI, in a previous member broadcast, had unexpectedly focused on Emperor Showa's Whitney documents and an unfinished novel by Kuniko Makoto.
Okay, we've covered a huge amount of ground, from popes to AI gods to hidden histories. If you had to summarize the big themes tying these sources together.
Well, we've definitely seen ideas about shifting global power, really alternative takes on major historical events and figures, speculation about AI's trajectory, and these glimpses into potentially hidden aspects of more recent history via sources like the Whitney document.
It's certainly not the standard textbook version of events. This deep dive definitely took us beyond the surface level of the source material provided.
Absolutely. And hopefully it gives you, the listener, some things to think about, the different ways stories get told and how power might shape those narratives.
So maybe a final thought to leave you with. When you encounter such wildly different, sometimes contradictory accounts like these, what's the best way to navigate that? How do you sift through it all to form your own picture of what might be going on?
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive today. We definitely encourage you to mull over these ideas, maybe even check out some of the source concepts for yourself and reach your own conclusions.